You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com and at Yahoo Sports Australia. And you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_Beeble and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. For today's mini show, I thought I'd do something different. A lot of people have been clamoring for something along these lines. I never really knew how to best approach it. I still probably don't know how best to approach it. But what we're going to be talking about in today's mini show is points leagues. So if those of you that don't play in points leagues, you can feel free to tune out now. Hey, just keep watching so the download counts and the view counts over on YouTube as well. But a lot of this will be specific to points leagues. But that is what I'm going to talk about. Michael Bolton.
Let's get to it.
Now, I've been pretty transparent in my thoughts on points leagues. I think they are rather simplistic and they are considerably more boring to me than category leagues. But I do have information regarding the percentage of people that do play in these leagues, and I think it's important to be able to address some of this stuff as well and talk about the rise of points leagues. From my data that I have received, the 35% of fantasy basketball leagues are points leagues at this point, at least out of the active leagues. So I think that's important to note. A couple of things before we get into what we're going to talk about today is I get questions often about points leagues. Now, what we're doing today is the standard NBA points scoring system. That's 3 points for a block and a steal, 1.5 for an assist, 1.2 for a rebound, standard point scoring. Your point system might be different. If you want custom point scoring and projections, we've got all that on Basketball Monster. Just enter your settings in and you can see how this all works. But I cannot cover every single point scoring format. The other thing to do is, people ask me, in a points league, what trade should I do? The number one spot that you always start at is what are these players averaging? Like that is your number one starting spot. One bloke's averaging 50, one guy's averaging 35, you take the guy averaging 50. Now there's always some context to assign to that, and that's what I do on the daily shows, is talk about guys whose value is rising and falling. And that can be applied across all leagues, as you're well aware. But in terms of, should I trade this guy? This guy averages 35.6, the other guy averages 35.4. I don't know. Like it's literally that's the same player. Like they'll have variations that go day by day and week by week, but in the end, there's no difference between those sort of guys. It's like, do you like the color of this guy's jersey better? It is really important to be able to know that. So if you are coming and asking me a points league, you've got to throw in context. There's no point throwing me scoring systems because I'm not going to go through and calculate everyone's numbers based on the overall scoring system for your league. Just what are that is the number one place that you start in all of these things. What are these players averaging? And then you can go and apply context to there. Will they improve from here? Will they decrease from here? Will someone come in and take this job? Are they filling in? All that sort of stuff is important. Now, when we're looking at standard points leagues, in general, if you're a top 100 player, you average about 25 to 27 points per game in the standard scoring system. That's a top 100 sort of a guy. A must roster sort of player is anyone above 25 usually is a must roster player. Your elite guys are in that 45 to 60 type zone. That's where we're looking at. For example, Harden averages 60 points per game this year. Yanni averages 59 per game. Your guys like Andre Drummond, who's the 7th best guy, is 49 points per game over the season. But that 25 type zone is around the rosterable area or the must roster type area for standard points leagues in your top 120 sort of a situation. So what I'm going to do on today's show, and I am open to other ideas from those of you who play in points leagues, what sort of stuff that you would be interested in me incorporating into the show. Because again, it is a great way of getting more people into fantasy basketball. I've said this plenty of times. My partner is playing in fantasy basketball for the first time this year. She has no idea about the NBA or fantasy sports in general, and she's playing in a points league this year. Some of you might be in that league with her, one of my Red Rock Challenge leagues. She's in that league. She's doing all right. But that's a great way to get people involved in the sport of the NBA and in fantasy basketball. It's a lot easier to grasp than the category type leagues. So you're getting more of this content out there. But I want to hear from you guys, because I personally don't play in points leagues. I'm in 1 points league. I don't play in them as a general rule, and most of my focus on category leagues. So I want to know what sort of stuff you guys want to hear and talk about in those sort of scenarios. So what I am doing in today's show is looking at some buy low players for points leagues, going again off the standard scoring system. The first guy that I want to talk about is Clint Capella of the Houston Rockets. Over the last 2 weeks, he's averaging just 36 points per game. He is over a 40-point per game guy over the course of the season, because in his last 7 games, he's scoring. Now, when I say, I'll try and differentiate between points and fantasy points. So he's averaging 36 fantasy points over the last 2 weeks, but because he's only averaging 11 actual points per game. Now, I think that can go up from him. The 2 blocks per game, 14 rebounds per game. He was at 20 rebounds per game at one point, but he should be able to be a consistent 40-plus point guy. Now, it's not a huge difference going from 36 to 40. That's not an outrageous number, but in the scheme of things, that can be a 15 to 20 spot ranking difference. That such is, and this is again part of the issue with trades in points leagues, is that so many guys, we might have 25 guys separated by 3 fantasy points per game. It's really quite a thin margin for error in those type of situations. So if you can try and acquire these boosts and bonuses by buying low and selling high and all that sort of stuff, it can be a pretty strong strategy in terms of winning your points league. So I think Clint Capella can be a better guy than what we've seen over these last couple of weeks. Another guy who is slumping a little bit at the moment, that's DeMar DeRozan, averaging just 32 fantasy points per game to make him 64th over the last 2 weeks. He's the 41st ranked player over the season. I think he can hover around that top 50 mark. If he was on any other team apart from the Spurs, I'd have concerns about a trade or a marginalization. I don't think that's going to happen necessarily with the Spurs, but he can bounce back. He's averaging only 16 points per game real life, which is really, really low. He can be an 18 to 20 point sort of a guy, and that should bump his fantasy points back up to over 36 a game. So there is some scope for a DeRozan improvement coming up. The table, Montrezl Harrell, another guy who I think is a bit of a buy low, averaging under 31 fantasy points per game over his last 7 games. For the course of the season, he's over 35 a game. So again, we're looking at like a 4-point differential here, which is enough to make that swing. And I highlighted again, if you've got a 4-point difference, that is like a 20 to 25 spot ranking difference. So it is quite a significant margin, even though it might not appear much. And I guess we've got to look at it in the scope of, if a guy is averaging 31 points, 4 points out of that is a pretty decent percentage chunk. You're talking about 13% difference. So it is a small volume, but a large percentage difference when we're talking about these sort of numbers. Maybe fantasy points leagues would be easier to differentiate if the point scoring was higher. Instead of the best guys averaging 60, they averaged 150 a game. And then you get everything spread out a lot more rather than having to dive deeper into the decimals, which makes things look a lot closer. That's an interesting thing. Of course, I have no say in the NBA changing their official scoring policy. But I think Harrell is able to improve there. Now, he's averaging 19 points a game, but the blocks are down. He's getting no assists or steals. The rebounds are only at 6 a game. So there is some pretty, some things there that we can see from Harrell that should be able to improve. Al Horford, another guy who I think is worth looking at as a buy low. 29 fantasy points per game, good for 82nd over the last 2 weeks. He's been the 56th best player over the course of the season. I think he can actually be like a 34 to 35 point guy, so there's a lot more room for improvement there. Averaging only 29 minutes a game over his last 6 contests. 10, 6, and 3. So it's quite obvious when looking at those numbers from Horford that we know he can get better, and that should all translate into good fantasy production. And those 28 minutes a game will give him 3 or 4 extra minutes there, and that should bump all the way back up. Now, historically, Johnny Isaac is not a great fantasy points league player. He has been much better in that area this year. He is a significantly better category guy. But over the course of the season, he's the 57th ranked player, averaging 33 or 32.6 fantasy points per game. But over the last 7 games, he is at 28.5. So that is a drop from where he's been all season. I think we look at him as a 30-plus point guy pretty comfortably. He did have the back tightness and hamstring tightness issue last game. I don't think that's a long-term worry. He's had some offensive malaise type performances. I think he's going to continue to get better in that area, and I think he's pretty much a lock to be a 30 fantasy point per game guy as we move forward. All right, the next guy on my list of buy low players is Fred VanVleet. Yes, VanVleet has missed a ton of time with that knee bruise, but now is the time to get him. We're not far off from him returning, but even before that knee situation, the numbers were down. He's been the 38th best player so far in points leagues this year, averaging 37 fantasy points per game. He has room to improve significantly, and the fact that he's injured, it makes him a pretty strong buy low, plus that return isn't too far away from Freddles VanVleet. Jamal, the Blue Arrow Murray, really good game last time out, but prior to that, he'd been struggling, averaging just 25 a game over his last 8 games. That's down from 32 fantasy points per game over the course of the season. I think he can actually push even closer to the 35 point per game guy into that top 60, top 55 type of area. He's averaging just 28 minutes a game. There's the Philadelphia trunk contusion game in there. 15 points per game, real life points per game. That's low. 0.6 steals, that's really low. So there's a couple of real big indicators there if he can jump up. And he's 119th over the last 2 weeks, went 61st over the course of the season. So some pretty significant room for the Blue Arrow to get better. Joshy Richardson, the next guy I talked about, he was on my category league buy low player list as well. He had a really good game against Miami last time. He's the 101st ranked player over the course of the season, but outside the top 175 over the last 2 weeks, averaging under 20 fantasy points. Now, I think he's more of a 27 to 28 fantasy point per game guy for the rest of the year. So that is a significant discount buy low scenario. He is available in leagues, actually available in 15% of Yahoo leagues. I think that he should not be available in any leagues whatsoever, points or category leagues, and you should be looking to grab him or get him on the cheap if available. And the last one I want to talk about is Marvin Bagley, who has made a return from a thumb injury. Hasn't been great, averaging 23 a game since that return. I think he pushes. Now, his game is perfectly suited to being a points league guy, a high volume point scorer and rebounder who doesn't contribute in the low volume categories very much. He should be a 30 plus point per game guy. We haven't seen that yet, and I think eventually we're going to see him push into a larger role this season. But this is the time to buy low on Bagley and hopefully start to get some of that return on investment. But the fact that he's averaging 23 a game since he returned, he should push to 30, maybe even 35 as we move forward. That'll do it for today's Points League mini show. Let me know what you thought of it. Let me know what you want to see more of this. I'm not sure how many Points League shows I'll do or what other sort of stuff I will include. But again, those numbers from Yahoo were really interesting to me, and I think it's important to cater to that side of fantasy basketball as well, especially in terms of growing the sport. Now, again, I don't see myself as some sort of be all and end all of fantasy, but there is a decent platform here that I can actually help to provide to grow the sport to people as well, and I think that's super important also. So tell your friends, let everybody know, and let me know what other things you'd like to see from Points League content for the rest of this season. Follow me on Twitter at redrock_Beeble, Instagram Locked On Fantasy Basketball, and subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube. Give me a thumbs up. Leave your comments down below. Keep them coming in thick and fast. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.